Welcome to the Psych Ward Podcast, where we have conversations with everyday people about men. We believe that every man has an authentic version of himself. So we're on a mission, and that mission is to find an answer to one question. What does it mean to be a man? Michael?
Hey, Eric.
No, I was asking if you're ready.
Oh, I thought you said, hi, Michael.
Michael, do you prefer
ready.
Michael or Mike?
Either one. Mike's
Okay.
good.
Right.
Mike's fine.
I just give him a hard time and call him Michael.
That's his parental way of addressing me.
Usually that's Michael. Yeah. If I knew your middle name, I'd use that.
I won't tell you.
Yeah. All right. Welcome back to the Psych Ward Podcast, where we have real conversations about men with men. I am Eric Ward, and as always, with me is my partner, Mike Lucas. Michael, how are you, sir?
I'm good. Thanks, Eric. How are you doing?
Good. I'm all right. So as we continue our conversation about what it means to be a real man, we thought it might be a good idea to just stop for a minute and take a look backward, really to try and figure out what did it used to mean to be a real man. How does being a real man today compare to, 40, 50, 60 years ago? If you look from a historical perspective, prior to World War II, I think men were expected to be strong, brave, maybe tough. They worked, they provided for their families, and they did their part to build a growing country. They invented things, they built things. Henry Clay, who used to be the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives in the 1800s, kind of famously said, "America is a country of self-made men." And he was right. So I guess the question is, what happened? And that's what we're trying to answer today. We sort of figured if we wanted to get firsthand knowledge about manhood from generations ago, we should probably invite an old guy on the podcast. So we have today with us the oldest guy I could find, Mr. Mark James. How are you today, sir?
Well, that was a glorious introduction.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I guess I'll take it as a compliment that age denotes venerability or something, as opposed to purely age, right?
Well, now you're using big words again. So, Mark, do you want to take a minute and just kind of tell us about yourself?
Yeah, happy to. My name is Mark James. I grew up in the Midwest. I'm a Midwestern boy. And I suspect as part of our conversation tonight, we'll get into a little bit of why that makes me so proud in terms of where I'm from, because it had everything to do with shaping me and who I am and what I believe in. I'm a business consultant. I work with B2B organizations primarily and help them with three things. Number one, improve the performance of their people and operations, help them manage the journey of change that might be brought about by a merger and acquisition or a restructuring of some sort. And then finally, I'm an analytics and marketing enabler, so I help organizations use good data and analytics to make better informed marketing decisions to get the right message to the right customer at the right time. So those are the three areas that I delve into. I've been doing these kinds of things all my whole career. More recently, I have my own business, Performance Advisors Group. And again, we focus on B2B organizations across those three areas I just discussed. And I'm happy to be here tonight. I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, well, we're happy to have you. Thank you. Mark and I have known each other for several years. And, Mark, when I first met you, one of the things that immediately struck me, I think probably before we even spoke the first time, but I was really impacted by how much of an old school man you were. You weren't somebody that I would ever refer to as a guy. You were a man. You dressed in nice suits and sport coats. You were classy without being flashy. You drove a nice full-size Cadillac sedan because America. You came across as educated, well-read, wise, and approachable. And one of the things that I think I noticed about you right away was that you only spoke when you had something valuable to say. So I think my first question for you, Mark, is how'd you end up this way?
Well, again, thank you for the description. I resonate with what you're saying there, and I am old school. I'll be the first to admit it. It comes from two things. It comes from the Midwest upbringing, and it comes from the family that I came from. My father was a member of the Greatest Generation. He was in World War II, grew up on the south side of Chicago, had a tough early life. His father, my grandfather, died when he was an infant, so he never knew his father. And I think that's, believe it or not, served him well, because I think he really was interested in making sure that myself and my two younger sisters had an upbringing that he didn't have. And I'm also blessed by having a great mother and the two of them were just great partners. So I attribute a lot of the way I am to my father and to where I came from. Growing up in the prairie, where you can see forever. The sense of morality and the upbringing that I came through. I came from a small town. My mother and father owned and operated a jewelry store for 50-some years before they both passed away. And so I grew up in a small business family in a farming community. I was lucky to have not only that great mom and dad and a great family environment that was very supportive, but then also in a small town in the 1950s and 60s and 70s when I was growing up, just all those classic values that we remember from days gone by for those who are perhaps my age or maybe even a little younger. They've served me well. And probably the one that sticks out the most in terms of what I learned is that at the end of the day, we're all responsible for our own actions, and there are consequences. And it was drilled into me that you have to make good choices in life. And if you don't make a good choice, you alone are going to suffer the consequences and have to pay for those. So I grew up fairly conservatively and always was not a risk taker, but only from an intelligent, hopefully informed point of view. I did dumb things when I was, a teenager, but I was a pretty good kid. And by the way, one of the things that we knew as kids growing up in my little hometown where I grew up, which is called Somonauk, Illinois, very odd name, but is that we knew that as kids, if we got in trouble at school, we were going to get it a lot worse when we got home. And I think that's missing to a great extent in today's world.
So, Mark, you've mentioned your dad a couple of times. Is he somebody that you would describe as kind of a real man?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
What made him that way?
He grew up in the school of hard knocks, as I say. His father wasn't around. He had to move around with his mother. So he kind of learned at an early age how he had to be self-sufficient. So I think that was part of it. And he grew up in the Catholic Church. So he had a Catholic Church upbringing, which I think tends to put guardrails or parameters around your behavior, right or wrong. I'm not going to comment on whether that's a right or wrong religion. It's up to people and their own individual choices. But I think that also helped to shape him. And he was, and I saw him as a guy who recognized that it's on me to provide for the family. It's on me to set a good example.
It's interesting. And if you don't mind, let me just, I want to refer to something for a minute. I came across an article called "The Men America Left Behind." And I want to read you a portion of that. And here's how it starts. It says, "For as long as America has been a country, the straight white American man has been king of the hill. But as society changes and culture evolves, the ground beneath that hill is growing shaky. Economically, physically, and emotionally, many American men are fighting to maintain a foothold." Psychologist James O'Neill from the University of Connecticut says, "What it means to be a man today is different than what it meant 20 years ago. There's a paradigm shift happening in our country regarding what it means to be masculine, and many men seem to be having difficulty adjusting to the transition." And there's a part where he talks about... you talked about your dad being self-sufficient, right? And they were talking about this study in the article, and they said the study found that conformity to three masculine norms: playboy behavior, power over women, and self-reliance are significantly linked to psychological maladjustment. I get the first two, maybe, that playboy behavior. I think, kind of playing the field and the dishonesty and the manipulation that comes with that. Power over women. Mike and I touched on that quite a bit last time. I understand that. But I cannot for the life of me figure out why self-reliance is something that, according to the authors anyway, has a detrimental effect on men's mental health.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think the reliance piece is part of what made those generations before me, and hopefully someone like me, a better person. I mean, you mentioned Henry Clay and the early formative years of this country. One of the most inspirational places to help make the point here that I've been to is a place called Independence Rock in Wyoming. Are you familiar with it?
I'm not.
Independence Rock is actually the top of a mountain that collapsed about 5 million years ago. So in Wyoming, between Laramie and Casper, there is this mountain that the top of this mountain that sticks out of the ground. It's sort of like a mini version of Ayers Rock in Australia, if you're familiar with that. It's just, it's this sort of desert arid area, and then this big hunk of ground that comes out, and it's all rock. It's named Independence Rock because it was on the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails for the early settlers that came west. And I would contend that probably some of the most self-reliant and risk-taking people that history has ever known are the pioneers that moved westward, that followed those three trails. And Independence Rock is the place that you needed to be by Independence Day if you were leaving, for instance, from St. Louis or the eastern ends of those trails, generally in the Missouri area. You needed to be at Independence Rock on the 4th of July in order to be on track to make it through the Sierra Nevada mountains 1,000 miles to the west before the snows came in. And when you get to this place, and you can it's right along a state highway, and there's a rest area there, and you can pull off, and it's about a 200 or 300 yard walk from the parking lot to this rock, and you can climb over the rock. And there are places on the rock where the settlers and the people that came through there in the 19th century, they carved their names and the date in the rock. There are just still several of those that are still visible in the rock. So there was actually a monk who went through there, and he called Independence Rock the Registry of the Desert because of all the names and stuff that are on that rock. And when you stand there, you get this sense of the amount of risk-taking and self-reliance you had to have. Hostile environment. In fact, you're immediately reminded when you're walking from your car in the parking lot to go to this rock, which is about a half a mile long and about 1.5 miles circumference or so. And it goes up to about 400 or 500 feet in the air, and you can walk up to it. But there are signs all on the sidewalk that say, "Stay on the sidewalk, rattlesnakes are everywhere." Just one of the many dangers that these people had. And when I stand there, I get the tingling feeling about what it must have been like for those people to do that, and how much of that we've lost through the development of this country and where we stand today. And by the way, I think self-reliance is one of the things that's made this country great, and we may be losing some of that.
So I guess along those lines, Mark, walk us through. I mean, I'm not looking for a blow-by-blow, year-by-year analysis, but since you were young, right? So you were a boy growing up, looking at your dad, and you saw him as a man's man kind of guy. Mm-hmm. Walk me through the changes that you've seen. Mike and I have talked about how, I don't know that we disagree, but we don't necessarily agree on some aspects of, today's version of manliness or what it means to be a man or a man's role. And Mike, I'm not even sure which term to use.
Yeah. I've been asking people these questions that we've talked about on our other podcasts, and men and women struggle to really kind of define what it means to be traditionally they can define that a little better than authentically. What does it mean to be an authentic male? And I remember this study, the more somebody is androgynous, the higher their well-being. So when I was thinking about self-reliance, I wonder if that contributes to loneliness. So I wonder if that's what maybe that author was referring to, was like self-reliance. Yeah, that could also lead to sort of a lonely lifestyle.
So it's interesting that you say that, right? Because in that article, one of the things they talk about is men striving to meet these masculine ideals, like self-reliance or whatever term you want to use, and they talk about them being threatened, consciously or otherwise, by societal shifts. And one of the things they say is that one study found that modern men who conform to a traditional masculine norm have higher rates of mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, and stress. And they go on to specifically relate it to self-reliance. And they talk about, that they're less likely to seek help when they need it. And they wrap it up by saying self-reliance may have been helpful in the past, but it is becoming increasingly outdated in our interdependent world. But there's a flip side to this, right? So the New Yorker magazine published an article called "What's the Matter with Men?" And here are just a couple of snippets from that. They said societal scientists agree that contemporary American men are mired in malaise. In academic performance, boys are well behind girls in elementary school, high school, and college. And in college, the sex ratio is approaching 2 female undergraduates for every 1 male. And they note that it was an even split at the start of the 1980s. They went on to say in this New Yorker article, men are increasingly dropping out of work during their prime working years. Almost 12% of men aged 25 to 54 are unemployed and not seeking work. In 1980, that number was only 3%. They said more and more men are overdosing, drinking themselves to death, generally dying earlier, including by suicide. They said it has been particularly rough in the last 20 or so years for men without college degrees whose wages have fallen, whose life expectancies have dropped markedly, and whose families are fracturing at astonishing rates. So we have one source that says, well, men who sort of refuse to latch on to change and conform to the new ideals of what it means to be a man, that they're much more likely to have mental health issues. While we have another source that says, hey, this shift in cultural norms for men is essentially killing them, literally. So I guess my question is, which is it?
It's a great question. From my perspective, I guess I'm an outlier with respect to the version that says that men today are falling apart or suffering from all those things you're talking about. I don't feel any of that myself, and my closest circle of friends that are men are don't feel that way either, and don't suffer through those kinds of challenges. Now, I'm not informed enough to maybe explain why my friends and me, other than at least for myself, I'll say that I have a dear friend many years ago that told me that, Mark, you were born about 40 or 50 years too late. And when he first said it, I was sort of taken aback. But the more I thought about it and I started to match against what I was seeing in the world today and around me, I found a hard time disagreeing with it. So
what did he mean by that? What are some examples?
Well, it was primarily referring to relationships and dating. At the time, we were both at dating age. We were much younger. As a gentleman I met in college, and was very conservative and sort of shy, and so I had a very I guess we would call it old-fashioned approach to dating. The guy always pays. The guy should ask. You open the door for the girl. All of those classic things that I was taught, ingrained into me by my father and everyone else in my cultural part of the world growing up. And the advent of feminism and all the other stuff that seems to have occurred in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years seems to have diminished the importance of those things. I personally am not going to stop doing those things. That is who I am. So I'm bringing forward with me the past, and I'm not about to change.
So, Mark, I distracted us a little bit, and I apologize for that. But
that's right.
I want to go back to what is it that that you've seen when you look, I don't know if it's decade by decade or generation by generation. I think we both come from very traditional values. You talk about even opening a woman's car door. Mm-hmm. I always do that for my wife. I do it for my daughter, who's still a teenager. She was kind of looking at me funny today. We were going somewhere and I opened her car door and she was like, well, what are you doing? And I'm like, opening your car door like I always do. But, she's in that teenage stage where everything's wrong. But the thing is, it's not just me. Like I remember when I was still single and dating, I went to pick a girl up and I forgot to open her car door, which, if my dad had been there, he probably would have, thrown something at me. But I get in the car and I look over and she's standing by the car door and I get out and I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry. And she was like, well, don't you normally? And I'm like, I do. I'm sorry. But it was her expectation too. So I don't know, maybe we were just both odd aberrations or what the case was. But as you look, I guess generation by generation, how have you seen, I don't know that there's any such thing as the average man, but maybe the cultural or societal definition of men change?
The best thing I can cite, and I just read about this the other day, and I've been sort of peaked to find examples with regular television, like network television and sitcoms. For the last, I don't know, I'm going to say 25, 30 years at least. Pick out a sitcom that you can think of, any one of them, and think about what kind of role or what kind of person is portrayed by the man in the sitcom. And a lot of sitcoms, quite often, they're family based, right? There's a dad, there's a mom, or there's a lot of single mom and dad comes around. But the male is portrayed as a buffoon, sort of a Neanderthal buffoon in today's world. The female characters are strong, and the kids are how should I say, the kids are they come off as arrogant to me, and I think that those roles and those situations and those kinds of shows are a reflection of our culture. Something has happened in our culture that has diminished or has de-emphasized the male from a traditional standpoint that we've been talking about, and has bolstered other figures or people in our lives. And I'm not casting aspersions on women. I mean that a single female mother has a lot to deal with, and there are a lot of them in this world. And talk about self-reliance. But it troubles me, to answer your question, to see how so much of the pop culture in this country downplays the role of the male in our society and almost relegates us to either a buffoonish, uneducated, or a buffoonish Neanderthal type of individual, as opposed to someone who is there and provide something of value or provide strength to the situation.
Mike and I have touched on that subject before, and I think both use the example of Everybody Loves Raymond. That character is a buffoon dad, and the mom and the kids just kind of roll their eyes and make fun of him. And I said when we talked about it before, I remember telling my older two daughters when they were teenagers, I'm not the kind of father you want to mock, right? And what's funny is, so since we talked about it, I've become more and more curious, and I've gone and done some research. And it's interesting because this shift really in our culture started after World War II. And there were several factors involved. You talked about your dad being part of the greatest generation. That was the first time that women went into the workforce and they did jobs that up until then everybody had just sort of accepted that they were jobs that could only be done by men. And as it turned out, women were just as capable in a lot of those jobs as men are. And it's a trend that continues even now. I saw a statistic that said 65% of mothers with at least one child under the age of 3 work outside the home. So women are continuing to work, but this research that I ran across was talking about how that shift, especially in media, really started in the 60s. And it's easy to blame everything on the hippies, right? But that really was a time when it sort of started. And part of it had nothing to do with their music or anything else, but it was really related to their countercultural movement, where they were just sort of radically opposed to any and all of the norms of society. And I think that included this concept of masculinity. You look like that's when all these young men and boys and even older men started growing their hair long, which that was traditionally reserved for women. Toughness was no longer a virtue that men should aspire to. Instead, it was all about the love, man. And so you can track from the 60s how that trend has just kind of grown and continued up to today.
Well, and it reaches into a lot of other aspects of our society. I remember reading several years ago the illegitimacy rate in the United States at the end of World War II was about 3.4%. And I think the latest number I looked at, it's something like tenfold that now.
Yeah.
Like at least 1 in 3 children are born out of wedlock.
Yeah.
And what does that say about our culture and our society? In fact, a gentleman that I know I have a lot of respect for, he made a statement one day. We were talking about this kind of stuff a little bit, and he said that the strength of a civilization is in inverse proportion to the promiscuity of its people. And so by delving into morality here a little bit and mores that, we're traditional, we're not what they are today. I probably am. One of my favorite quotes, and I'm still looking for who I came across this quote a number of years ago, and still looking for the author. But the quote is, quote, "Any successful effort to decouple civilization from morality lays the groundwork for works of fevered horror." I think this stuff is all connected, I guess is the point I'm trying to make.
I think there's an impact there that I think it would probably hurt us to not at least touch on. As you've grown and changed and matured and progressed through life, do you think the changes in morality are one of the biggest changes, particularly when it comes to the impact on men and who they are?
Yeah, I think there is an impact. There is an impact. I for myself, try my best to resist relaxing those virtues that are very important. So I think that does have an impact, and it's touched all parts of our society, and part of that whole era you were talking about with hippies and music and all that kind of stuff. Just be yourself. Like do what you want to do. Don't worry about rules and regulations. Just be you. And I think there's a responsibility that goes along with being a human being, and is that, again, and it goes back to, hey, we're all responsible for our actions. There are consequences to our actions, and we're responsible for them. And so anything that tells people it's okay to not worry about the consequences of your actions, there's a natural tendency, if people fall into that trap of believing there are no consequences, or I don't have to pay a consequence for my actions, I think it helps explain a lot of the stuff we see today in our society.
So put that in the framework of men specifically, because I think you and I are probably on the same page about this. Societies have rules for reasons, and it's part of what makes us a society is what are our rules? What have we decided is going to be the expectation for individuals to be part of the group? What will they do, and what are they not allowed to do? In our society, we decided as a society that murder is wrong. It's not acceptable, so we don't allow it. And if you do it, we punish it. And if we take that rule away, then we have chaos. But specifically, I guess, for men, when you look at the changes in society as the rules have changed, maybe, or maybe the morality, I don't know which term is the right one, but what has changed and how has it redefined men?
I'll touch on an electric rail here in our culture and society, because I think that this helps explain and answer the question. When abortion became so easy to obtain in this country, it made it easy for men to not accept, or easy way to get out of the responsibility of being the father. And we have big portions of our society where there are a lot of fatherless children, and we don't know who dad is. He's not around. So I think the ease at which you can escape the consequence of pregnancy has an impact here to answer your question. That's not the only thing. I would say it's an indicator.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, that's interesting. I found this survey. It's not scientific, but it's interesting. Knowingless website, knowingless.com.
Okay.
Posted by Ayala is her name. And she posted a survey. 800 people responded, men and women. And one of the things that the women rated as highly masculine traits was cowardice. And I think that sort of speaks to what you're talking about,
Yeah.
Mark. It's that.
Are you sure you're reading that
Yes.
right?
Yes. I read it like 10 times.
When you just said that, my eyes opened up. I mean, wow.
Yes. I read it over and over. Cowardice. One of the traits that women rated as highly masculine, and they had a rating from 0 to 100, 0 being not masculine, 100 being highly masculine. Cowardice was in the top 5.
I'd like to understand what the sample was, the profile of the sample.
Well, it was just 800 people randomly.
Right.
So again, not scientific, but interesting.
Yeah.
So I wonder if maybe they weren't saying that was a desirable masculine trait, but instead was a trait that they attribute to men.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Because they did look at desirable traits too on a separate survey. So this was totally attributable to men or women. Now, the other side of that, men also rated that as highly feminine. So you've got both. It's like women said that was a masculine trait and men said that was a feminine trait. Mm-hmm. So out of those 800 people, that's what she found. That's just one thing. But I thought that kind of illustrated kind of what you're saying, Mark, is like the ability to just, ignore your responsibilities as a father.
Yeah.
That is pretty cowardice. And maybe that's where that comes from.
Well, it could be. And that's sort of my mindset or my position on this is that it is a form of cowardice, and it's an example of trying to escape a consequence of your actions.
Yeah.
And abortion isn't just the only thing. There are a lot of some other ways in which I think men find it easier to shirk their responsibilities or not accept the consequences.
Yeah,
but I think it begins with little things. As the culture begins to change, and we de-emphasize the importance of opening the door for the girl, or for the male's responsibility to pick up the check and to be responsible for certain things. When you diminish those things, it's sort of like death by 1,000 cuts, right?
Yeah.
Over time, you wear down the desire to do the right thing, and I wonder for a lot of men, is it even so? They do it because and not because they consciously do it, but becomes a self-conscious thing because they're just trying to assimilate themselves into the view of the world today. I personally reject all that. I guess I'll be fighting to my dying day to not give up some of those things that I thought made men and our society much better than it is today in many respects.
So, Mark, let me ask you a question that I think Mike and I have been wrestling with so far, and I think we anticipate we'll continue to wrestle with this question for a while. But I guess answer for us from your perspective. What does it mean to you to be a real man?
It means fulfilling my role and responsibilities as a provider or a partner in a marriage, to my children, to my colleagues in the professional world, to make sure that I'm a person of my word and I'll deliver what I promise. And if I can, I'll find somebody who can from a professional standpoint. So it's being there. It's being there when you're expected to be there. It's delivering what you promise, and understanding that at the end of the day, we're all responsible for our own actions. So I think that those are probably the three. I guess it's three things I just mentioned that form the basis of to answer that question.
In that answer and in pretty much everything you've said so far, there's a common theme running through it, and that is responsibility.
Yeah.
And it sounds like for you, that is the most important facet of living up to being a man. And I would suspect that it probably ties into that morality that we discussed, and even the politics and the family life, and all of it tied in together.
It's all tied together. And the other thing that, and you and I have talked about this, goes back a few years ago. Look at how people in today's world, how they apologize for something that they were responsible for, so something they did to affect someone else. What's the classic apology these days? I'm sorry you feel that way. That's not an apology. An apology, by definition, needs to accept responsibility. I apologize for what I did to cause you pain or harm. That's a true apology, not saying I'm sorry for how you feel. That's a scapegoat. That's an out.
The first book that I ever wrote was called How to Fail as a Husband. And there's an entire chapter in there that's dedicated to apologies, because I agree. I think that is a life skill that has been lost for most people. And it's a skill that my wife and I have tried to teach our children. I suspect me more than her. I think she comes from a family that struggles with apology. But I remember telling all of my kids and other people as well, and clients that I work with, there's a formula to apologies, and you can make it your own. But the formula goes pretty much like this. You say the words, I'm sorry. You say what you did, what you're sorry for. You acknowledge what you should have done instead. And then you ask for forgiveness, which is the tough part for people, right? Because you're putting the outcome of the entire situation in the other person's hands. Like, I'm putting this ball in your court now, and you get to decide whether or not we're going to be okay.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing for people to do. We live in a society that really tells us that we don't have to be accountable for anything, that there's always some excuse for what we did wrong. And it, of course, lies outside of us and our purview and responsibility. And so I think more and more people struggle with apologies.
Oh, I agree. And it hasn't been reinforced or taught. None of that is talked about or reinforced any longer. Just like one of the things, go into at least any school that I'm aware of today, elementary school. When I was a kid growing up, in every classroom above the blackboards were a series of pull-down maps in geography. And it's astounding to see the number of people these days, younger folks, who are literally ignorant of geography. And you'll ask simple questions like, what's the capital of the United States? Springfield, Illinois. You get answers as silly as that. And what does that say? And that gets back to what's being taught and reinforced. The behavior you get in life is the behavior you reinforce, and that behavior can be bad or it can be good.
Yeah. One of the things I know Eric and I have talked about in the 90s, late 80s, all through the 90s, there was this concept that came to kind of fruition about relationships, and that the male needed to do at least 50% of the household duties. And I was young. I was in my early 20s and just getting married. And that concept was pretty foreign to me at the time. Since that time, I've kind of adapted to it, and I was doing dishes before this podcast, and I still think of that as a female responsibility, even though I still do them, and I do them quite often. I would say at least 50% of the time. I still, as of today, think that that's a female responsibility. I cannot shake that, and I don't feel angry about it, but it's just one of those things. My dad, I don't think I saw him do dishes. He did start doing them in the 90s, though. when that whole thing came about where men need to step up and do more. Have you had to go through any of that, Mark?
Yeah, I gravitated toward in my adult life to maybe because before I got married, you'd have to do everything for yourself. So you did your own dishes, everything, and then when I got married, I just sort of naturally gravitated toward doing certain things. Now, I fought for the longest time. I don't like doing dishes.
Yeah.
I hate it. and it just because I don't like doing it, it's just kind of a pain.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I'm the one in the household that does the laundry.
Oh,
I love doing the laundry because guess what? You can do other things while you're doing laundry, right?
That's true.
You put the clothes in, you go do something else, you come back, put them in the dryer, and so on and so forth. So that's how I've sort of gravitated to taking on those kinds of responsibilities. And I recognize that any kind of relationship, with your spouse, there has to be shared responsibility. It can't be all one-way street.
Yeah.
And I think that goes beyond just
I think
male versus female.
It's just funny how we automatically tag those things as masculine or feminine.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Even
going
to
the store, going shopping.
Mm-hmm.
I still, to this day, Mike and I kind of touched on, I've struggled with some medical issues, and my wife, Kelly, has had to do more around the house than she typically does. But you let her come out of the garage with one of my drills or screwdrivers and a small ladder. And it doesn't matter how bad I feel that day. I am up off the chair and I'm like, nope, nope. That's my job. Give me my screwdriver. You don't know what you're doing anyway. And it's such a, to use a common term, misogynistic approach. But I still have this belief that, fixing things around the house is my job. And she has other jobs. What's funny is there are certain things, and cutting the grass is one of them, that we almost race on Saturday mornings to see who can get up and get dressed and get out to the garage the fastest.
Really?
Because we both like cutting the grass.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And we don't have a riding mower or anything fancy. Like it's an old school push mower. And I think my wife likes to do it because she likes it when the yard looks nice. I like to do it because it's a completely monotonous task and I don't have to think about it.
Yeah, right.
It's the same reason I like chopping vegetables when I'm cooking and I like sanding when I'm woodworking, because there's no thought involved other than don't cut your fingers off. And
yeah, right.
So, and for me, cutting the grass, but other than that, we seem to have fallen into a very stereotypical sort of approach to doing things, other than, there's some things like I do most of the cooking. And there's some other stuff. You talk about doing laundry. My dad was one of those guys who he would tell you when he was young, he got married and it didn't matter if his wife was working too. She was going to do everything around the house and he was going to come home and read the paper. And and when my mom died young and he got remarried right away, their marriage fell into that same trap. But what's interesting is I would say the last, I don't know, maybe 10, 12, 15 years of his life, he did all of their laundry. It was the one thing that, and part of it was he was struggling with heart issues. And so he was short on energy and it didn't require a lot,
right,
to pick some clothes up, throw them in the washer and fold them when they come out of the dryer. But it was something that I remember him telling me, yeah, I do all the laundry. And my immediate response was, okay.
Well, I to this extent, I think every relationship sort of falls into and defines how we're going to split those roles and responsibilities out. And I remember my dad always did the cooking out, the grilling. He would do the grilling. Mom did all the things in the kitchen. Now, my mom was very big on, I don't want people in my kitchen. This is my domain. And my dad, I think, respected that. I think it was also driven by the fact that he worked a hard day, a long day at the store and came home. He was tired. So they kind of reached an equilibrium with that. Now, I have a question for you, Eric. You were just talking about when Kelly grabs a tool or something to go outside or do some kind of work, and you said that you immediately want to jump in and do that. The question I have is, are you doing that because you see that as your responsibility, or are you doing it because only you think that you can do it correctly?
Both.
Okay.
I mean, if I'm going to be honest, it's both. I think it's my job to fix things around the house and to build things that need to be built. And the thing is, because I've taken that approach for right or wrong. Kelly has never really had to do that kind of stuff. And when she was growing up, her dad did all the fixing and repairing around the house too. So she doesn't really know how to do it. And there have been some times where, maybe I'm just super tired from, working a really long day, or maybe I'm not feeling great that day. And I actually won't interfere when she grabs a tool to fix something. And Mark, there have been times where I'm watching her try to do it, and it's not because she can't, it's because she has no experience with it, right? And so there are times where I'm watching her try to do something, I'm like, move, just let me do this. And she's more than happy to do it. But part of it too is honestly just, I kind of feel like this is a man thing. This is my job. It's my responsibility. And the irony is, I grew up with a dad who couldn't tell the difference between a pipe wrench and an adjustable wrench. I mean, he didn't know the difference between a wrench and a screwdriver. He couldn't fix anything. And so where did that come from? I don't know. Maybe I was born with it. Maybe it's Maybelline, but I just, it's who I am and it's how I think. Going back, you're talking about your dad doing all the grilling. Do you know when outdoor, like backyard grilling became a thing?
When?
It was after World War II.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, because there was this shift going on in society, right? No longer were women going to stay at home and do all the cooking and all the cleaning. And they were expecting their husbands to no longer go to work all day and then go to the bar and hang out with the guys. They were expected to come home and participate in family activities and be present. And the men didn't know how to do that. And so one of the ways
not without
that they
fire.
found, not without fire and meat, right? You got to have a wood fire and meat, fire. But it was one of the ways that men, I think, found to adjust to this newfound expectation that they were going to be home as opposed to at the bar with the guys until 9 or 10 o'clock at night. And so because they weren't about to be inside doing laundry or changing a baby's diapers, they went where the fire and the meat was and started this outdoor grilling thing. Not that grilling didn't exist before that, but it really found its popularity when that cultural shift happened after World War II.
I will not cook, but I will grill.
Correct.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Funny.
The fact that you and Kelly are rushed to want to mow the lawn, all I can say is that your reward in heaven will be great.
No, it's fun. But we only have like a quarter acre, so it's not a huge piece of property.
Right. That makes a difference too.
Yeah, no kidding. So Mark, anything else that you can think of? I guess maybe the question that I want to ask you, and I'm probably opening up a can of worms here, but when you look at the maybe stereotypical modern man, what do you see?
I guess you're asking in today's world and given expectations to society now, as opposed to where men came from historically.
Yeah. So you look at a 30-year-old today, right? What's the average 30-year-old man in our society like?
I think they're different from when I grew up. The sense of self-reliance isn't what I remember growing up, or a need to be self-reliant and to be responsible for your own actions. I find it interesting that in today's world, when mom has a child, a newborn, that men now get maternity leave, or the equivalent of maternity leave. That was unheard of way back when, right?
Interesting in a good or bad way?
Well, I think in this particular case, that's a progressive move that makes sense, because it sets up a situation where the mom is not having to do everything with respect to the newborn, and the man is around to help with things that need to be handled. So I think that's probably a good thing. I think a lot of moms way back when had to suffer in silence because it was expected you're going to take care of all this stuff, and dad's going to go out and farm the field or do his job or whatever. I think that's probably a good thing, but it is different now than it used to be. To help answer the question.
When my youngest was born, she was a bit of a surprise baby. Of course, we found out my wife was pregnant with Emma about a month after we cleared out our storage room and got rid of all the baby stuff. So,
yeah.
Timing's everything. What's that saying? Men make plan and God laughs.
Yes. That's right.
But, surprise baby, but I mean, just an absolute blessing in many ways. But it was interesting because when she was born, my wife, Kelly, was very close to 40. And, the older you get, the harder pregnancy is, at least from my perspective. And she was wiped out during the pregnancy. She was wiped out immediately after she gave birth to Emma. And I didn't take a lot of time off of work. I think I probably took a week off. And then I was back at work. But what I did find was that I came home from work and I immediately I took over everything when I walked through the door when it came to Emma and the house and doing the laundry and doing the dishes and making the meals and cleaning the house and changing diapers. And Emma was very colicky when she was born. This was before they had invented those gas drops that make all the crying go away. We didn't know about those. So, So I remember just spending hours and hours just pacing our house with her, singing to her, bouncing her, trying to get her to stop crying, so that my wife could sleep. And to me, that seemed perfectly normal. And I remember thinking at the time, this is not something my dad would have ever done. He not because of maliciousness or laziness or anything like that. I think it just wasn't done that way. And I was happy to do it. I was exhausted doing it, as was Kelly. But I think that's a positive shift in many ways.
Yeah.
But I don't know that there are as many of those positive shifts as there are negative. It's interesting. One of the other things I came across a couple of years ago, there was a Twitter post that went viral. And it claimed that the average testosterone levels in American men had dropped 50%. And so that number is not quite accurate, but there's some truth to it. So there's two different studies that were kind of being referenced, I think, by that claim. One was they measured average testosterone in men between 1999 and 2016. And during that time frame alone, so 17 years, there was a 25% drop.
Did they say why?
Yeah.
So one of the things they attribute it to is the increasing rates of obesity. Obesity in men tends to drop testosterone. So the study, and there was another study that was an overlap from 1985 to 2000, and I think there was a 22% drop during that time. So if you add those together, even though there's overlap, you get close to that 50%. So I get where the number came from, but it wasn't really accurate.
Weird.
But the thing that kind of ran through my mind is you think about what makes men men, and testosterone is one of those things. Our higher levels of testosterone, it's what makes us bigger and stronger and hairier and all those other things.
Yeah.
But if we make the argument that testosterone is really a big part of what makes us men and differentiates us from women in particular. And these values have dropped by nearly 50% in the last, 40 years. Okay, I guess it makes a little bit of sense that men are less manly.
Yeah, biologically speaking.
Yeah. There's a lot of that. There's a great meme I saw, and I wish I could show it, but I saw it about a year and a half ago, and it was a 2-frame picture, and one frame had a picture of Cary Grant walking into a building, and he's just dressed to the nines. As you might imagine, Cary Grant from Cary Grant's era, he's got a full suit on. He's got this overcoat on that just dashing looking figure. His shoes are shiny. He just looks perfectly nice.
The perfect hat. I've seen it. Yeah.
The perfect hat. He had the fedora in his hand.
Yep.
Walking into a building, dashing looking figure, all those things you would imagine Cary Grant in some of his best movies. The frame next to it has a picture of a guy from today walking down the street, looking at his phone, He's got a man bun. His skin is very pale in color, and he's wearing no socks and shoes, and then very almost skin tight shorts.
Wow.
And the caption of this dual frame picture read, "What happened?"
Very different.
And what you're just what you were describing here, it just made me think of that. And back to the obesity thing, I think we have to go upstream from obesity to get at the root cause of obesity. I think a lot of changes have happened in our diet, and the food system in this country is loaded with preservatives and all sorts of things that pretty much are not good for us.
Definitely.
And so that's another I think, impact of the modern world compared to 40 or 50 or 60 years ago.
So, Mark, listening to you talk, I think the things that I'm most interested by are I think the best description is your sense of values. That what you were taught and you contributed to maybe your Midwestern upbringing. And I think that probably plays a role, but I suspect it has more to do with how you were raised and who you were raised by. I joke about my dad, not knowing how to fix anything, but my dad was a man, and he taught me to be a man. He taught me about respect for others and hard work. And, I remember being a teenager and being so angry at my dad because he never showed up for my basketball games. Well, the reason the man didn't show up was he was coming home from his job and going to a second job because we were short on money, because my mom was sick and there were medical bills. And so, of course, that was just me being an obnoxious teenager and being self-centered. But this is a man who saw something that needed to be done, and he did it. He, at least to the best of my knowledge, never complained about it and just did what he needed to do. And I think that's what resonates with me, and Mike and I always try to end our podcast with a takeaway. And I think my takeaway from listening to you talk about, and I'm going to throw you under the bus here, but you're 70 plus years on this earth. I think my takeaway is listening to you talk about your dad and the values that he taught you, and how those values, in particular, the values that are related to responsibility as a man. And it's interesting because our culture has demonized men in many ways, and in some cases for good reason, but demonized almost all men because of their supposed male expectation of rights and privilege that come with being a man. And I'm not going to argue that there aren't men who have that belief system, but that never even came through in anything that you had to say. And I think that's my takeaway is for you, that sense of responsibility and how maybe we've lost that to some degree.
Yeah. As a man, I don't have to win. At the end of the day, I mean, I want my epitaph to be in line with what Grant LaRice said. It's how I played the game.
Yeah. So, Mr. James, what is your takeaway, if you have one?
I would say, the impressions left upon my father, that left upon me, and then coupled with that, as important, is a stable home environment. I had a mom and a dad that were always around, had a supportive, larger family, and then just the culture and the way in which I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, and everybody was like-minded. All the other parents were the same way with their kids. So I grew up in an environment where I was getting reinforcement about the sense of responsibility, and it's up to you to do the right thing and understand right from wrong. So I think all of that would be my takeaway, is that I owe a great deal to that collective experience I came up and grew up in, and how I was taught, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. I think I'm a better person for it. And I think that I can continue to be the right kind of male in the world today, from where I came from, without all the negative baggage from the old days, those old stereotypes about, women stay in the kitchen and men don't have to do that kind of stuff. But at the same time, I can pull my own weight and I can chip in and help to match what society expects today. So I like to think that I'm a modern man to that extent, but I have never lost track or forgotten where I came from.
Very good. And Mike, what about you? What's your takeaway?
Well, it was a pleasure having you, Mark. It was great to hear. What I really liked and resonated with was the Midwest upbringing. Yeah. I really resonate with that. I had the same thing. I grew up in Iowa. So parents that were together since high school. And what I also liked about this conversation was that the three of us have, and I think it's occurred, and knowing what I know of Eric and my own relationship, naturally occurring responsibilities, I guess, would be the way. So Eric cooks. I mentioned, doing the dishes, and Mark, you mentioned laundry. Those are all kind of traditionally female, especially in the generations we came up in. But we do them. I think that authentically speaking, those could be things that we like to do. You both mentioned you like to do those things, and that makes us a little more authentic when we can be the person and do the things that we like to do. So it was good hearing about those things too. But I think having these conversations, bringing these conversations to the public, are all good things for both men and women.
I agree. And, the part about maybe being lonely as a male, I agree with that, because sometimes especially in today's world, no one cares about us. We're all roughly the same age, and we're just expected. You got to deal with this,
Yeah.
And I'm fine with that. And what I would say to any male out there that feels exceptionally lonely or where it's really affecting them, talk to another guy.
Yeah.
Talk to another male and just talk through it and do it over our favorite, adult beverage, which is one of the things men like to do.
It's interesting, Mark, because I that issue of loneliness, I've told people that I think that male loneliness is bordering on epidemic.
Yeah.
In our country, and there are lots of reasons for it, but some of them are how we're wired. How we're wired to engage with people as men. Some of it is social training. Do this, don't ever do that. Don't ask for help, don't need help, that kind of thing. And I one of the things that I hope will change, because it's actually not changing for the better. It's changing for the worse. Statistically, young men today are lonelier than you and I were when we were their age.
Yeah.
And that has to do in some cases with the fact that not only are they wired like we were and socially trained like we were, but they're also they're self-trained to be reliant on technology and social media for their contact. I read an article one time, and I'm getting way off base here, I apologize, but the title of the article was "Have Smartphones Ruined a Generation?" And it was written by a psychologist who treats primarily adolescents. And she was talking about all of the negatives that have happened, the suicide rates and the loneliness and the social failures. And it was funny because she also talked about some positives that have come out with American adolescents. Reliance on or addiction to cell phones. The fact that many, many fewer teenagers drink nowadays than used to be the case. Teenage pregnancy rates have plummeted since smartphones became a thing, which makes sense. I mean, you want to get pregnant, you have to actually leave your room and put down your phone. And people just don't do that.
Not anymore.
But but you're right. But I think that's also a part of what's contributing to young men's loneliness. And I don't know what the answer is. I wish I did. I know that I have been blessed for much of my adult life with some very good friends that I can talk to. And I'm not a guy who has a ton of friends. It's not my style. But I've always had a very small handful of friends that I can come to and just say, hey, and I think I've talked about this before, but the agency where I work, we run a large domestic violence offender treatment program. We have groups for men and women who are court ordered after they get arrested for domestic violence. And the men, it's interesting because, these men, they all come in like, oh, I'm mad at the courts, I'm mad at my attorney, whatever. But when they get past all of that and they see that there's this opportunity to have real conversations with other men, and that it's safe and that nobody's going to talk about what they say and talk about them, they engage for the most part. And it's probably for most of them the first time they've ever had an opportunity to have a real, honest, transparent, and safe conversation with another man,
proving it works.
And how sad that's the case.
Yeah.
But
the other tip I would add to that, just as part of just my parting shot, would be, if you're feeling very lonely as a guy or a man, one of the things I don't worry about for myself. I am not going to be that person that dies because my heart blows up out of my chest because I've been holding everything in my whole life. I emote. I get it out. I don't hold things in. And so I would encourage people to get things out. Now, you got to be careful how you do it. You don't want to ramrod or steamroll people, but it's perfectly okay to express, or maybe it's just to the mirror or your dog. Just say, hey, I'm really mad today and I can't stand it. And so as a result of me getting rid of emoting that stuff, I don't hold stuff in.
Mark, do you cry?
Oh, I have. Oh, yeah.
There's an article. I actually just pulled it up again. It's called "The Lost Art of the Manly Weep," and it's talking about how in history, crying for men was perfectly socially acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
It even goes all the way back to Homer's Iliad. They said, consider Homer's Iliad, in which the entire Greek army burst into unanimous tears no less than 3 times. Zeus weeps tears of blood, and even the immortal horses of Achilles cry buckets at the death of Patroclus. And they talk about even in the Middle Ages, this French epic called the Song of Roland. The poet describes this reaction to the death of the hero. The lords of France are weeping bitter tears, and 20,000 faint in their grief and fall. And the article goes on to talk about they have no real answer to why men don't cry anymore. And she says in the article, it's not like there was a big anti-crying campaign that somebody successfully put out, but you look, she talks about even the Bible being full of references to weeping. And she says even God himself as the incarnated Jesus cried. And yet somehow we ended up in this place where men can't express their emotions anymore.
Wow. Yeah. The last time I did was actually very recently. Was it Memorial Day? It was a few days after Memorial Day. It was the weekend after. They did a Band of Brothers marathon, all in 10 episodes or whatever it was. I watched the whole thing. And I've seen it before, but at the end of that movie, they talk to Major Winters, who led the 502nd, and he talks about he said, do you remember when we were talking, and my grandson asked me, and he reiterated, he said, my grandson asked me, Grandpa, were you a hero in the war? And Winters' response, your grandfather was not a hero, but I served in a company of heroes.
Wow.
That is real. It's like, especially when you understand what they went through. The greatest generation is aptly named. They really are.
Absolutely.
Just like the people who founded this country. There are times in history. I'm going to diverge for just a second, and I'll shut up. There are times in history when certain forces come all together at one time in a very fortuitous way. The greatest generation is an example of that. The founding of this country, the founding fathers, and their vision and what they saw based upon what they had lived through and what they saw for the future of this country. And it's embodied in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. It's a very rare point in human history where that many people came together to form those kinds of thoughts and to lay out what we all enjoy today. We should never forget it.
Yeah.
And I guess my parting shot is we seem to be in a time period right now that is on the entire opposite end of the spectrum. It seems to be a convention of idiots trying to destroy the world. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
Mr. James, you obviously are a well-read and highly educated person. How do you use that in your work? What is it that you do specifically?
Well, nearly all of my work is based upon my personal experiences, through my career in business, and just what I do to help my clients. And it comes from knowing the typical barriers that can get in the way of a business operating in its highest and best state, particularly as it relates to its people and the operational elements of the business. There are barriers that get in the way all the time. And even the world's best run organizations have barriers that come up every once in a while. So what I do is I take my experiences, having been in a number of different businesses personally, as well as what I've observed and growing up in a small business family. I take all those things that I've learned in my observations, and I use those to help my clients find and fix those barriers that get in the way. And quite often the barriers may not be visible. So it takes an outside independent set of eyes and ears like myself to come in and say, you're part of the baby's ugly over here, and here's how and why, and here's how we can fix it.
Fascinating.
So if I'm running a business and I want you to come in and help me, how do I get a hold of you?
You can reach me at my phone number is 630-882-9107. My email is markj, MARKJ, at perform, PERFORM, advisors, ADVISORS.com. And Perform Advisors is one word.
And you work with people all over the country, don't you?
Yeah, I've worked with people all over the country. I have done international business. I've worked with Fortune 50 companies and helping them with change management. I did a project many years ago for Caterpillar, helping them worldwide with their helping change management around putting new processes and technologies in place across 37 business units. So we were dealing with 37 business units and helping them to overcome the resistance to change that naturally occurs when we have change in organizations. Quite often it triggers a fight or flight response. Mm-hmm. So that was a very gratifying project. And so I know how to sink my teeth into big, complex things. And if it's not something I can or should be doing, I will help you find the person to do it, because I know a lot of people. I have a big Rolodex of people with all different sorts of expertise and abilities.
Do you still have an actual Rolodex, Mark?
Figuratively speaking.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Mr. Mark James, it has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you, for taking the time to speak with us. Mike, as usual, thank you.
Yeah,
it's been a pleasure.
Thanks to both of you.
All right.
Thank you both. I appreciate it. And best of luck to you as you go forward here with the podcast.
Appreciate it. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.